No uniform. No insignia. Just an ordinary woman waiting for coffee. Or so he thought.
One glance, one careless assumption. He had no idea who he was talking to. Excuse me, you'll find the visitor center over there.
This is a coffee kiosk?
For officers only, that way.
Okay.
What's your rank, sweetheart?
I'll manage.
90 minutes later, he was standing security detail for the same woman from that line.
4 generals saluted her. And he finally understood exactly who he'd insulted.
If you believe that real respect has nothing to do with how someone looks and everything to do with who they actually are, this story is going to hit you right in the chest. This is a story about assumptions, about the quiet, decorated woman nobody bothered to really see, and about a moment of humbling truth that no one in that room will ever forget. Stay until the very end, because what happens next is going to remind you why you should never underestimate anyone. And if this story moves you even a little, tap that like button and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be shared. Now, let's begin. General Michelle Carter had exactly 40 minutes before her connecting flight when she stopped at the small coffee kiosk inside the officers' lounge at Naval Base San Diego, dressed in plain civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, sneakers she'd worn through 3 different deployments, carrying nothing that identified her as anything other than an ordinary 52-year-old woman traveling alone. She'd learned, over 30 years of military service, that plain clothes on travel days meant fewer conversations, fewer double takes, fewer moments of having to explain, yet again, that yes, she really was who her ID said she was. It was a small mercy she allowed herself between the relentless formality of active duty as a 4-star general commanding U.S. Pacific Fleet operations, one of only a handful of women in the nation's history to hold that rank, and the simple, uncomplicated act of standing in line for a coffee like anyone else. Her path to that rank had been anything but simple. Michelle had entered the Naval Academy in an era when women made up a small fraction of each incoming class, when she'd been told, more than once by instructors who considered themselves encouraging, that she'd do well for a woman in whatever assignment she eventually received, as though her ceiling had been quietly predetermined before she'd proven anything at all. She'd spent the first decade of her career being tested in ways her male peers simply weren't, watched more closely, forgiven less easily, promoted more slowly despite performance evaluations that consistently ranked her among the top of her cohort. She'd learned to let her record speak where her presence in a room sometimes couldn't, understanding early that some battles were worth fighting loudly and others were better won through the accumulated, undeniable weight of simply being excellent for long enough that doubt became impossible to sustain. Petty Officer First Class Dean Holloway, 29 years old, a Navy SEAL with 6 deployments and a growing reputation within his unit for confidence that occasionally tipped into arrogance, was waiting in the same line, mid-conversation with 2 junior teammates about an upcoming training exercise, when Michelle stepped into the queue just ahead of them. Dean glanced at her, taking in the plain clothes, the quiet, unassuming posture, the absence of any visible rank insignia, and made the kind of instant, careless judgment that years of being surrounded by an insular, hyper-masculine warrior culture had quietly encouraged in him without his fully realizing it. "Ma'am, this line's actually for base personnel," Dean said, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular condescension of someone who'd decided within 2 seconds of looking at her that she couldn't possibly belong there. "Visitor center's just down the hall, if you're looking for base tours." Michelle turned, taking in the young SEAL's trident pin, his confident posture, the easy authority he clearly carried within his own world. "I am base personnel," she said evenly, her voice carrying the calm, measured patience of someone who had encountered this particular flavor of assumption more times than she cared to count across 3 decades of service. Dean, entirely unbothered, smiled the easy, dismissive smile of a man who genuinely believed he was being helpful. "Right, sure," he said, glancing at his teammates with the faintest hint of amusement. "What's your rank, sweetheart? Junior enlisted admin, maybe? I promise the line moves faster if you head over to the civilian side." The word landed in the small space between them with a particular familiar weight. Michelle had been called worse things by less consequential people across a career that began in an era when women, and black women especially, were routinely assumed into administrative roles regardless of their actual qualifications. Routinely underestimated by men who couldn't imagine command authority existing behind a face that didn't match their internal template of what leadership looked like. She'd learned, decades earlier, that correcting every single assumption in the moment wasn't always worth the energy it cost. That sometimes the most effective response was simply patience, and the quiet certainty that reality tends to reveal itself eventually, usually at exactly the moment someone least expects it. "I'll manage," Michelle said simply, turning back toward the counter, ordering her coffee, and stepping aside without further comment, leaving Dean and his teammates to their conversation, entirely unaware of the collision course they'd just unknowingly set in motion. What Dean didn't know, and had no reasonable way of knowing given the deliberately unremarkable way Michelle had dressed for her travel day, was that she was scheduled in exactly 90 minutes to preside over a change of command ceremony in the base's main auditorium, an event that would gather nearly every senior officer stationed at Naval Base San Diego, including 4 separate generals from adjacent commands who'd flown in specifically for the occasion. Dean, coincidentally assigned to ceremonial security detail for the same event as part of his unit's rotating base support duties, had no idea, as he took his position along the auditorium's side entrance 90 minutes later, freshly changed into his dress uniform, that the woman from the coffee line was about to walk through the very doors he was standing beside. The auditorium filled steadily over the following half hour, rows of officers in dress uniforms settling into assigned seating, the particular formal energy of a change of command ceremony building toward its opening moments. Dean stood at attention near the side entrance, scanning the arriving officers with practiced, professional alertness, when the doors at the rear of the auditorium opened and 4 generals, 2 Army, 1 Air Force, 1 Marine Corps, each a decorated senior officer commanding significant regional authority in their own right, entered together, moving with the unmistakable formality reserved for genuine occasions of protocol. Dean watched them settle into the reserved front section, noting with a professional's automatic attention to detail the rows of ribbons on each uniform, the particular quiet authority each general carried simply by entering a room. He'd stood ceremonial detail dozens of times over his career, and had grown, if he was honest with himself, slightly numb to the specific gravity these moments were meant to carry, treating them more as procedural obligation than genuine occasion. That numbness was about to be shattered in a way he wouldn't fully recover from for months. Dean straightened further, recognizing immediately that whatever was about to happen carried significant institutional weight. Then the side door nearest his position opened, and Michelle Carter walked through it, now in her full dress uniform, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, ribbons and decorations spanning 3 decades of distinguished service, arranged with the precise formality of someone who had earned every single one of them through consequences Dean couldn't begin to imagine. The 4 generals who had entered moments earlier turned as one, straightened to full attention, and rendered a crisp, synchronized salute. Dean felt the air leave his lungs in a single, silent rush of dawning horror. He watched, frozen in place, as General Michelle Carter returned the salute with the easy, practiced authority of someone for whom this gesture had long since become second nature, then moved through the assembled officers with quiet, commanding presence, exchanging brief words with each general in turn, the entire room organizing itself around her arrival with the particular deference reserved for genuine institutional power. It was Master Chief Petty Officer Reyes, Dean's immediate senior and ceremonial details supervisor, who noticed his stricken expression and followed his gaze toward the general now taking her position at the ceremony's front podium. "You all right, Holloway?" Reyes asked quietly, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I talked to her," Dean said, his voice barely above a whisper, the words tasting like ash even as he spoke them. "This morning, at the coffee kiosk. I told her the line was for base personnel. I called her." He stopped, unable to fully complete the sentence, the memory of his own casual, dismissive tone now replaying in his mind with excruciating, humiliating clarity. Reyes, following the full weight of what Dean was confessing, let out a low, sympathetic whistle. "Son," he said, "I genuinely hope she didn't take that personally. because if she did, your career just got significantly more interesting. The ceremony proceeded through its formal program, speeches, the traditional passing of command, applause at appropriate intervals, while Dean stood at his post, trying unsuccessfully to focus on anything beyond the mounting, sick certainty that he'd just insulted one of the most powerful officers in the entire Pacific Fleet's command structure, directly to her face, over coffee, that same morning. It was during the closing reception, as officers mingled in the auditorium's adjoining hall over light refreshments, that General Carter approached the ceremonial security detail directly. Moving with the same unhurried, measured pace Dean now recognized with a fresh wave of mortification from their earlier encounter. "Petty Officer Holloway," she said, reading his name tape with the calm precision of someone who had clearly already noted it hours earlier. "I believe we met this morning." Dean, every instinct screaming at him to somehow disappear entirely, straightened to rigid attention instead. "Yes, ma'am. General, I owe you a sincere apology for my conduct at the coffee kiosk. There's no excuse for how I spoke to you." Michelle studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the particular way Dean imagined must be useful for someone who'd spent 3 decades navigating rooms designed to underestimate her. "Tell me something, Petty Officer," she said finally. "In your unit, when a new operator joins your team, how quickly do you evaluate whether they can be trusted to have your back in the field?" Dean, caught off guard by the question's direction, answered honestly. "Pretty fast, ma'am. You learn to read people quickly. It's a survival skill." "It is," Michelle agreed. "And I'd guess that skill served you well, more often than not, in situations where speed of judgment actually matters, where hesitation costs lives." She paused, letting the observation settle. "The problem, Petty Officer, is that the same fast judgment that keeps you alive in combat can make you lazy everywhere else. You looked at a 52-year-old woman in a coffee line and decided, in under 2 seconds, everything you needed to know about her. That's not a survival skill in that context. That's just a habit you haven't examined closely enough yet." Dean, absorbing the observation with the particular clarity of someone recognizing an uncomfortable truth, nodded slowly. "Understood, ma'am. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Michelle said, though something in her tone had shifted slightly, softened at the edges in a way that suggested she wasn't interested in simply humiliating a young service member for the sake of it. "For what it's worth, Petty Officer, I wasn't offended this morning. I've had considerably ruder encounters than yours across 30 years of service. What concerns me more is the pattern underneath it, not the specific moment. You're clearly a talented operator. Talented people can afford to be careless about who they underestimate for exactly as long as it takes for that carelessness to eventually cost them something that actually matters." Over the following months, an unlikely mentorship developed between them, initiated not by any formal program but by Michelle's own quiet decision that Dean's mistake, handled correctly, could become a genuine turning point, rather than simply an embarrassing story he'd carry defensively for the rest of his career. She invited him, along with several other junior service members flagged by their commanding officers as high potential but rough around the edges, to a series of informal leadership discussions she hosted monthly in her office. Sessions that had nothing to do with tactical training and everything to do with the less glamorous, harder-to-teach skills of genuine leadership, humility, situational awareness beyond the battlefield. The specific discipline of extending respect to people before they'd proven themselves worthy of it rather than after. The first session, Dean later admitted, had been the most uncomfortable 90 minutes of his professional life, sitting in a small conference room with 5 other service members he barely knew, uncertain whether he was being quietly punished or genuinely invited to grow. General Carter opened that first meeting not with a lecture, but with a simple question directed at the room. "Tell me about a time someone underestimated you and how it felt." The stories that followed, halting and unpolished at first, gradually revealed something Dean hadn't expected, that nearly everyone in the room, decorated and capable as they all were, carried some version of the same wound he'd inadvertently inflicted that morning at the coffee kiosk. It was, he realized slowly, less a punishment than an invitation to understand the very thing he'd failed to extend. Dean, initially attending out of a mixture of obligation and lingering guilt, found himself genuinely transformed by the experience over the following year. He began noticing, with a discomfort that gradually shifted into genuine self-awareness, how often he and his teammates made similarly careless assumptions about people outside their immediate operational context, dismissing base support staff, assuming civilian contractors lacked relevant expertise, treating administrative personnel with the same reflexive, hierarchy-obsessed dismissiveness he'd once directed at a woman in a coffee line who turned out to command the entire Pacific Fleet. "You know what the real lesson was for me?" Dean told Master Chief Reyes nearly a year later, the two of them grabbing coffee at the same kiosk where his humbling had originally begun. "It wasn't really about rank at all. It was that I'd built this whole mental shortcut for deciding who mattered and who didn't, and I never once questioned whether that shortcut was actually accurate. Turns out it wasn't. Turns out it was just laziness wearing a uniform." Reyes, who'd watched the entire transformation unfold with the particular satisfaction of a senior NCO seeing a promising young operator actually grow rather than simply age, nodded approvingly. "That's a harder lesson than most people your age ever actually learn, Holloway. Most guys just get embarrassed and move on. You actually changed something." General Carter, for her part, never made a public spectacle of the incident, never used it as a cautionary tale in wider briefings or official channels, choosing instead the quieter, more personal approach of simply investing in the specific young man who'd made the mistake in front of her, trusting that genuine growth mattered more than public accountability for a moment that, in the end, said considerably more about assumption than malice. 2 years after that coffee kiosk encounter, Dean stood again at a formal military ceremony, this time as the one being recognized, receiving a commendation for exceptional leadership during a complex joint operations exercise that had required precisely the kind of cross-unit collaboration and situational humility he'd spent 2 years deliberately, consciously cultivating. General Carter, now serving in an even more senior advisory role within the Department of Defense, attended specifically to present the award herself, having followed his development with the quiet, invested attention of someone who genuinely believed in second chances built on real change rather than simple apology. "You've come a long way, Petty Officer Holloway," she told him afterward, shaking his hand with the same measured, deliberate presence he now recognized as entirely characteristic of her. "I had a good teacher," Dean said, smiling, "even if the first lesson was pretty humbling." "The best lessons usually are," Michelle said. "I've found that people rarely learn much of anything from moments that don't cost them something first. You just happen to get yours delivered with a side of coffee." Dean laughed, the easy, genuine laugh of someone who'd long since made peace with the story of his own mistake, understanding now, in a way he hadn't fully grasped that first mortifying morning, that the woman he'd once dismissively called sweetheart in a coffee line had ultimately given him something far more valuable than the apology he'd initially owed her, the uncomfortable, necessary chance to actually become someone worth the rank he already carried. He kept, from that point forward, a small habit he never fully explained to anyone who asked about it. Whenever he found himself in a line, a waiting room, any ordinary, unremarkable space filled with strangers, he made a quiet, deliberate point of assuming nothing about anyone, until they'd given him reason to assume something specific. It cost him nothing. It occasionally embarrassed him less than his old habits once had. And more than once, in the years that followed, it led him to conversations and connections he never would have allowed himself if he'd still been the same young operator who'd once decided, in under 2 seconds, that a woman in a coffee line couldn't possibly be anyone worth his full attention. If this story reminded you that real respect costs nothing to extend and everything to withhold, and that the person you underestimate today might be exactly the one holding the standard you'll eventually be measured against, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that true strength is never loud about who it actually is.